Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, January 23rd, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingenie est odissi cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The crimes of the U.S. government are not much known in the U.S., but they aren't new. Since at least the end of the 19th century, the U.S. has been determined to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia, under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of the world by the American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, stopping their Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone in 1941, so the U.S. could concentrate on Japan. In World War II as a whole, the U.S. had 500,000 casualties, but Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in defeating Nazi Germany. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia, Russia and China, and retarding its economic development. The American task is more difficult today at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China, and their alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's why the U.S. has those 1,000 military bases around Russia and China, while Russia has 15 bases outside its country, and China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. After the war, the U.S. State Department noted that we had 50% of the world's wealth, but only about 6% of the world's population. That the goal of U.S. foreign policy was to maintain the disparity, as the State Department said in a secret memorandum. They wrote, quote, "To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction." Close quote. Our immediate national objectives after World War II have been economic control of the world. For most of my life, that was presented as a struggle with Russian communism. But we weren't told that the communist bloc never controlled an economy more than half the size of that of the U.S. From World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain that economic control of the world. And it continues. President Obama was the first president in history to be at war throughout 2 terms. In the presidential campaign, Donald Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting, Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist campaign in modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed at the time of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, which began America's longest war. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. has been at war almost continuously since World War II, putting down challenges to its economic control of the world. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph for the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia and China. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close 1,000 U.S. overseas military bases. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which of course represent the views of the American political establishment and are in the business of manufacturing consent to those views from you. We'll try to give a better account tonight. And our first story concerns the war in Afrin. Afrin is a section of Syria occupied by the Kurds. The Kurds as a national group, as an ethnic group, and their Arab allies stretch across the northern part of Syria and into Iraq. It's confusing when you listen to the American media refer simply to the Kurds, because they're in fact a variety of different political groupings amongst the Kurds, groupings that include a variety of territories in both northern Syria and northern Iraq. But the news this week is the attack on the Kurdish group holding the westernmost section of northern Syria called Afrin. The attack is by the government of Turkey, the military of the Turkish military, and the war has been proceeding throughout the week with only confused accounts on the most part, for the most part, in the American media. To reduce the situation to its most brutal to a brutal summary, we might point out that the fighting this week, the new fighting this week in northern Syria, is a result of the long-term American military presence in Syria, which is perfectly illegal. It is not sanctioned by the United Nations or by the legitimate government of Syria, as the Russian presence in Syria is indeed sanctioned under both of those terms. But what's happened this week is the Turkish military has attacked this Kurdish section of western Syria, northwestern Syria, on the grounds that this Kurdish political entity is a threat to Turkey. There is a Kurdish independence movement, a Kurdish movement within Turkey that the Turkish government considers terrorist, and the Turkish government has said that it's not going to have a Kurdish independent government on its border, particularly one sponsored by the United States, as the Syrian Kurds are in fact. Secretary of State Tillerson of the United States stated last week that the U.S., in spite of its illegal status in Syria, would continue a military presence in Syria. The U.S. said that it had a military presence in Syria only to counter the terrorist group ISIS or Daesh, and that once ISIS was destroyed, it was implied the American troops and planes would be removed from Syria. Last week, the Secretary of State, the American Secretary of State, said almost casually that no, that wasn't true. The U.S. had no intention of leaving Syria. Well, this has also a history that is not readily available to most Americans. The revolt against the government of Syria, the Assad government, began in 2011 domestically. That is, there was a popular upsurge against that government as part of the Arab Spring. In Syria, that was particularly vigorous, in part because it was a response to agricultural reverses, a long drought, that the population of Syria felt the Damascus government, the government of President Assad, was not doing enough to deal with. The war went on for a good while because the Obama administration saw that this was an occasion to eliminate one of its major enemies in the Middle East, that enemy being the government of Syria, since the government of Syria had thrown in its lot with America's principal Middle East enemy, the government of Iran. So what the Obama administration did was find the most vicious Islamicist fighters, jihadists, terrorists, that it could in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other parts of the Persian Gulf, send them into Syria, give them arms, and tell them to overthrow the government of Syria. This is nothing new. In a sense, it's the same policy that the American government has followed throughout the Middle East for more than 40 years. It was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was President Carter's national security advisor, who constructed the first jihadists by finding the most vicious Islamists he could in the late 70s and send them into Afghanistan, as Brzezinski said at the time, to give the Russians a Vietnam of their own. The U.S. support of war throughout the Middle East has always been part of the general geopolitical goals of the United States, the goals to thwart the economic integration of Eurasia and to stop the Russians particularly. The invention of modern terrorism in the Middle East by the United States was designed primarily to do that. And the same pattern was repeated in Syria by the Obama administration. With that as a background, we can understand Secretary of State Tillerson saying a week or so ago, no, we're not leaving Syria. The suppressed premise was we have other fish to fry in Syria, other Arabs to fry in Syria finally, and we're going to keep doing it. The operation that the Turks launched this week, which they call, you don't know whether they're simply being funny or obtuse, the operation is called Operation Olive Branch, in order to suppress the Kurds along the Turkish border in northern Syria, was a response to Tillerson's comment in that Tillerson has said that the U.S. intends to establish a Kurdish military force along the Syrian-Turkish border of as many as 30,000 fighters. This is madness on the part of local politics, and the Turks have responded understandably, I suppose. But what is really at stake here, of course, is American policy in the region. The outcome of this particular fighting seems to be dependent in part on Russian policy. The relationship of Turkey to both Russia and the United States has been particularly complicated, but it seems that Russia, with its legal military presence in Syria, has, at least by implication, given Turkey permission to control this Kurdish region along the border, as it were in return for the Damascus government's control of the region of Idlib, which is in revolt against the Damascus government. This is a deal that Moscow seems to have brokered and has allowed, therefore, the Turks a relatively free hand in northern Syria. It hasn't opposed them militarily, at least. And both Russia and the United States have said this week that the Turks should withdraw from northern Syria, but they haven't done anything to enforce that. So the fighting goes on, the killing goes on. Last week, the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, who has been talking since about many of these issues for a good long time, said, and I quote, "It's a fact that U.S. forces are seriously involved in creating alternative government bodies on vast part of the Syrian territory." And he's referring in part to the Kurdish groups. And this, of course, absolutely contradicts their own obligations, U.S. obligations, which they committed to on numerous occasions, including at the UN Security Council, on maintaining the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Syria. Close quote. Eminent truth from the Russian foreign minister, while the U.S. And Russia both deplore but do not move against the Turkish attack on the Kurdish area, the Kurdish region of Afrin. That's where we stand, the state of play at tea break, we might say, with all those dead folks lying around in northern Syria as a result of this week's activities. And which way it will go is sort of difficult to say at the moment because the various actors are rarely candid about what they're doing and what they're going to do. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the wars the United States is responsible for around the world and the lack of coverage of those wars by the mainstream media in this country. I want to turn to a symbolic war in Washington, the war this past week that led to the shutdown of the U.S. government. It has been also, it seems to me, quite remarkably badly reported in mainstream media because of the interest that the media show, mainstream media show on these matters. As usual, one has to go outside American mainstream media to get any sense of what's really happening because American mainstream media is devoted to the interests of dominant social groups in America, the political establishment, if you like, and you're not going to get a straight story from them. As the late Phil Oak said many years ago, in all American communities, there are many shades of political opinion, and one of the shadiest of these is the Democrats. I think that was borne out again this week by the actions of the Democrats in the shutdown operation. The Democrats were posturing around the Dreamers. The Dreamers are the people who came here under the DACA program in the Obama administration and before. A program that recognized the presence of people who were brought into the U.S. as children and have grown up in the U.S. without citizenship because they were born elsewhere and came in technically illegally, when they were children. Now, these folks are adults now, of course, we're talking about. These folks are asking for a continuation of the program that allowed them to reside, if not be citizens, within the United States, as it was the case before. The Democrats say that until they have an agreement on the situation of these dreamers, these people seeking the American dream, from the Trump administration, they will not agree to a continuation of the operations of the U.S. government. Well, the crisis ended rather quickly when the Democrats said, oh yes, we have an agreement now from the Republicans in Congress to talk about this issue in coming weeks, and therefore we will withdraw our objections to the continuing resolution that will finance the federal government or parts of the federal government for the coming weeks. What in fact the Democrats are doing here in their posturing around the dreamers and the government shutdown, they're running a zombie Clinton campaign, I think is probably the best way to describe it. After 40 years of accelerating and growing and accelerating inequality in America, the Hillary Clinton campaign, presidential campaign, tried to build a majority by pretending that social distress in America was the result of discrimination. Of course, there is discrimination in America, as we all know, but the discrimination is not the root cause for the social distress that Americans feel, as people around the world do, that grow into the movement that's called populism. The source of that distress is not discrimination so much as exploitation, the exaggeration of capitalist exploitation that began 40 years ago with the neoliberal policies of American business. This was a conscious program by American business in the wake of the Vietnam War and opposition to the Vietnam War to reassert, as it were, the rights, in inverted commas, of capital, and to destroy those elements in American society that tried to alleviate the pressures of capitalism, that moderation of exploitation that went back to the New Deal, that went back to the Great Depression. That tradition, that arc of social democracy, you might say, peaked in the early 1970s and was countered by the rise of neoliberalism, the attempt to reassert the rights of capital, put down labor unions, remove social supports up to and including Social Security, workers' compensation, matters of that sort, and reduce the American population to a capitalist workforce. It did pretty well, neoliberalism. We've had 40 years of increasing inequality in America. Inequality declined from the Great Depression to through the 1970s, but the curve turned around and it began increasing under the neoliberal program from the 1970s to the present, and it increased at an accelerating rate. And it was that inequality and the perception of that inequality that was the underlying issue in the last presidential election. The Clinton campaign said, no, we'll continue the neoliberal policies and the neoconservative policies as well. They meant respectively more inequality and more war. We'll continue those, said the Clinton campaign, but we'll take care of people who are discriminated against. Blacks, women, other groups, sexual minorities that have not fully been incorporated into the American capitalist rat race. We'll bring them in from the cold. This was the line that the Clinton campaign took the Democrats have been taking for a while, and strangely, it didn't work. The candidacy, the peculiar candidacy of Donald Trump, was based on attacks on the neoliberal and neoconservative policies, the more war and more inequality policies of the Obama-Clinton administration. The attacks were inchoate, unclear, but Americans did hear that because they were aware of the distress, both in regard to war and the economy, that they'd been experiencing in the previous years. They had elected Obama on the grounds of hope and change from those policies. But they had 8 years of not getting that hope and change. And so when the Trump-Clinton administration, the Trump-Clinton election came around, they heard the possibility of change again, not the same old song from Hillary Clinton. Trump, almost by accident, expressed the real cause of the dismay of the American electorate, the dismay that was parallel to dismay elsewhere, in Europe, for example, and that goes by the general names of populism. The real cause of the rise of populism was exploitation, the capitalist rigorization that had come with neoliberalism. Trump was the first major party candidate, major party presidential candidate in 40 years to attack the neoliberal and neoconservative policy that had characterized all administrations since the administration of Jimmy Carter. How right he was is demonstrated by the furious reaction of the political establishment, which has had the effect of ensuring that the Trump administration continues the neolib and neocon policies of the previous administration, more war and more inequality, not by defending those policies openly. That's not what the political establishment has done. That would court the populist opposition, but by furiously attacking Trump's character to the extent of the Russiagate and Putin's puppet fantasies. I was shocked to see the number of signs and so forth indicating that Trump was being manipulated by Russian President Putin at the Women's March last week. The politics underlying that march were the politics of the Clinton campaign. With the Dreamers, the Democrats have found a small grieved group whose very real grievances they can champion, while they cooperate with the Republicans in support of widespread exploitative policies, flat wages, and the lack of social supports, such as health care and education, which are taken for granted in other countries. It's a great catch, that catch-22. It's a great dodge on the part of the Democrats. Oh, please don't throw us into that briar patch of neoliberal and neoconservative policies, say the Democrats to the Republicans in Congress. And when those policies are reasserted, as indeed they are by this Congress and not just by the recent tax bill, the Democrats can, as usual, try to have it both ways, saying, oh, we're standing up for people who are discriminated against, we're working for those folks and so forth, and by the way, we're acquiescing in the same policies that exploit them all along. This is the peculiar situation we find ourselves in today in regard to the major political parties. The Republicans, nefarious as they are telling the truth of what they're doing, and the Democrats, who are doing the same thing, are lying about it. That's the situation we find ourselves in Washington these days, and it's not directly connected with the wars the U.S. is carrying on, but it's part of the political situation that makes those wars possible and that avoids a real political discussion in America. It's the lack of political discussion of both the economic and military policies of the U.S. government that allows that government to continue those policies against the interests of what the American government knows is its major enemy, that is, the American people. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about American war making and the sorts of things that are going on around the world. what the American public actually thinks is often difficult to discern through the attempts, largely successful, of the American media to mislead the American public and shape its political ideas. That's the reason we have such confusion around the principles or the policies that are being proposed in a presidential campaign. This week we had a report of a new poll of Americans that shows what we've known to be the case for many years, going back indeed before the 20th century. A new poll shows that the American public, is overwhelmingly opposed to endless U.S. military interventions. Now, this poll is about contemporary views, but the dirty little secret about the American government is that the public has always been opposed to American war-making and has to be cajoled and stampeded into supporting wars back to the Civil War. This was true before the First World War, it was true before the Second World War, it was true in regard to Korea and Vietnam. These were wars that were not popular in America until the American propaganda machine began to convince Americans that their vital interests were dependent upon killing Asians in the case of the last two. Last week, the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Foreign Policy, that's a bipartisan advocacy group calling for congressional oversight of America's lengthy list of military interventions abroad. This group released the results of a survey that show broad public support for Congress to reclaim its constitutional prerogatives in the exercise of foreign policy. If you want to go refer to your local constitution, see Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States that defines the responsibility of the Congress to declare war, not the presidency. Undertaken last November by the J. Wallen Opinion Research, the new survey revealed, quote, a national voter population that is largely skeptical of the practicality or benefits of military intervention overseas, including both the physical involvement of the U.S. military and also extending to military aid in the form of funds and equipment as well. Those jihadists that Brzezinski and Tillerson were supporting. Bill Dobell, the spokesman for the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy, said last week, we started this initiative to give a voice to the people, and the people have spoken. Congress needs to enact more oversight before intervening in conflict abroad, close quote. The headline findings show, among other things, that 86% of those surveyed, American public, feel the American military should be used only as a last resort, while 57% feel that U.S. military aid to foreign countries is counterproductive. It produces war rather than stopping it. The latter sentiment increases significantly when involving countries like Saudi Arabia, with 64% of Americans saying military aid, including money and weapons, should not be provided to such countries. The poll shows strong, indeed overwhelming support for Congress to reassert itself in the oversight of U.S. military interventions, with 70% of those polled saying Congress should pass legislation that would restrain military action overseas in three specific ways. One, by requiring clearly defined goals to authorize military engagement. Two, by requiring Congress to have both oversight and accountability regarding where troops are stationed. Three, remember those 1,000 bases overseas, right? Three, by requiring that any donation of funds or equipment to a foreign country be matched by a pledge of that country to adhere to the rules of the Geneva Convention. That would put a crimp in the style, certainly, of Saudi Arabia and Israel. The results of the J. Wallen Opinion Research Survey would seem to track with the results of another study undertaken last year by Francis Shen, a law professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, and Douglas Kreiner, a political science professor at Boston University, who found that Hillary Clinton's loss in the 2016 presidential race might well have been owing to her hawkish foreign policy positions. The study, entitled Battlefield Casualties and Ballot Box Defeat, did the Bush-Obama wars cost Clinton the White House, ? Which was released last summer, found that a divide is emerging between communities whose young people are dying to defend the country and those communities where young people are not. That divide, which the author termed the casualty gap, what we're talking about there is what's been called the poverty draft, that the Americans who are actually in the military are not there as a result of a draft, as was true during Vietnam, but they're there because there aren't other jobs. And this is shown simply by the enlistments in the American military from depressed communities across the country. Those depressed communities contributed to Donald Trump's surprise victory. Indeed, even controlling in a statistical model for many other alternate explanations, the authors found there was a significant and meaningful relationship between a community's rate of military sacrifice and its support for Trump. And while Trump has largely betrayed his campaign promise to put America first, particularly with regard to Middle East policy, he does so at the risk of alienating his base. Nevertheless, the new survey indicates the desire for a sensible American policy abroad goes well beyond Trump's base, and that there's a wide bipartisan majority that seeks an American foreign policy of realism and restraint, i.e., not carrying on the 8 foreign wars that Barack Obama did. The researchers at J. Wallen note that, even in spite of what they call a climate of distinct political polarization, a nice way of saying what was going on in the last presidential campaign and since, the result shows that these sentiments vary only in degrees of intensity across political party ideology, age groups, gender, and geographic regions. The survey found that 78% of Democrats and 65% of Republicans and 69% of independents supported restraining military actions overseas. Rarely, noted the report, does opinion research reveal issues that enjoy shared sentiments on a bipartisan level, close quote. This is nothing new. I mean, we've spent a great deal of effort from President Obama running for office in 2008 to the articles in the News Gazette this week to convince people that there wasn't that much opposition, after all, to the Vietnam War. What was the case is quite otherwise. By 1969, 70% of Americans thought that the war in Vietnam was not just a mistake, it was a crime, that the U.S. was committing a crime by sending its army to Vietnam to kill people for reasons that were far from clear to the American public. This anti-war sentiment was not the view of a little group of hippies. This anti-war sentiment was the American vision, and it was that had to be countered by the American government so that it could get its wars on in the following years. After the first Gulf War in 1991, then President Bush the first, said that the real purpose of the war was we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome in the head. What he meant was that the opposition to war that grew out of the experience in Vietnam had so convinced Americans that these wars were wrong, that the new war in the Middle East was at work changing that view, perhaps. But the anti-war sentiments of the American public seems not to have changed. Indeed, even in the years of the even in the 21st century, with the attempt of the American government to convince the American populace of the virtue of its wars, including the greatest military crime of the 21st century, the invasion of Iraq. It hasn't worked. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the fourth week of 2018. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. Coming up tomorrow, Wednesday, January 24th, is a demonstration at the University of Illinois College of Law. It's a rally against a associate of the Trump Sessions administration at the College of Law from 3 to 4 p.m. Wednesday, January 21st. Our friend and colleague Francis Boyle of that law school writes, Law Dean Amar is bringing in his top Trump Sessions legal henchmen to propagandize their party line. For the past year, he and his department have been arguing the Trump Sessions cases in the U.S. Supreme Court and lower federal courts, and will continue to do so. The Muslim travel ban, against Dreamers, against sanctuary cities, against migrants, against blacks, against LGBTs, against labor, for war, etc. Every reprehensible policy and practice that Trump adopts will make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Stewart, tomorrow's Speaker, and his office will argue in favor of Trump Sessions and against the American people. Right now, Trump has a solid right-wing majority in the Supreme Court with his man Gorsuch, the new Justice of the Supreme Court. Please join us in demonstrating our concerns over the continuing downward spiral of human rights, both here and abroad, by our government of elites, with the abandonment of the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Our continued militarization and war on people around the world in order to occupy and steal their resources, with further oppression and exploitation of the working class and of people of color in this nation. Close quote. That's tomorrow, demonstration at the School of Law, Wednesday, January 24th, 3 to 4 p.m. in the Law School Plaza. Also, finally, on Friday, beginning at 9 a.m. in Levis Faculty Center in the little university down the street, is a conference on the global Middle East. A number of speakers, both from the local faculty and elsewhere, will be speaking from 9 to 4 p.m., not continuously perhaps, in conference room 210, Levis Faculty Center, on this Friday. We'll conclude tonight with the third of a series from the Real News Network that we're featuring this month, an interview with Norman Finkelstein, whose new book is entitled Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the blog, on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Our show is produced by Jason Liggett, Nathan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and do see the Facebook page for Aware. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the American government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mandel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate, continuing our conversation with Norman Finkelstein, author of the new book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Let's get into this is a tough issue for many people, but you take it on, which is the morality of Hamas and all the other Palestinian factions of armed struggle. Now, you write in the book that under international law, Hamas has every right, Hamas and all Palestinian factions, because by the way, it's not just Hamas that uses force inside Gaza. There are several factions there. But you write that under international law, they have every right to armed resistance. Can you explain that?
Well, I was pretty careful in my choice of words because I went through the scholarly literature on the subject, and the most authoritative opinions by, say, James Crawford at Oxford is that there's no law barring, prohibiting people's under occupation and struggling for self-determination. There's no law barring them from using armed force to gain their self-determination or to end an occupation. On the other hand, international law is very clear and unequivocal that an occupying power or a power denying a people the right to self-determination does not have the right to use armed force. Now, that raises the next level of analysis is two complications. Complication number one on the side of Hamas is, even if they have the right to use armed force, or there's no law prohibiting them, do they have the right to use weapons which are inherently indiscriminate and therefore cannot target military sites or military personnel, but will end up causing significant civilian death? So there's a question that's a secondary level of analysis. They have the right, but do they have the right to use indiscriminate weapons? On the Israeli side, they don't have the right to preserve an occupation. They don't have the right to deny a people the right to self-determination, but do they have the right to use their weapons in self-defense? That's their claim, okay? So, if you allow me, let's look at each of those questions. Question number one, Hamas's use of indiscriminate weapons. First of all, as a factual matter, let's set aside the quality of the weapons. The weapons are basically symbolic. They're the equivalent of fireworks. As Khalid Michel put it at one point, the head of Hamas at that moment, he no longer is, he says they're our cry to the world. You know, it's a kind of, if I can use my language, it's a kind of SOS. They're sending these flares into the air. SOS, we're dying. SOS, we're dying. That's not an exaggeration. When Mary Robinson from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, when she went to Gaza in 2008, she said, a whole civilization is being destroyed. I am not exaggerating. A whole civilization is being destroyed.
Okay.
So if you send up flares saying SOS, we're dying, which have next to zero impact on civilians, next to zero, I think whether or not they're discriminate or indiscriminate, it's beside the point. They're doing no damage. They are almost entirely symbolic.
Okay, but here's my problem with that. To say that they're entirely symbolic and
almost entirely
symbolic, and that's their SOS, presumes that that's their only method of letting out an SOS. And firing rockets, even if they're futile, is not the only way. I mean, you've pointed this out, that they could engage if they wanted, they could organize a mass nonviolent campaign. But you write in the book this, you say the ultimate question is, do Palestinians have the right to symbolically resist slow death, punctuated by periodic massacres, or is it incumbent upon them to lie down and die? But why are those the only two options? I mean, why is it an option, instead of exercising their symbolic right to resist, why is not, instead of directing your energies towards that, towards violence, in the case of Hamas, directing it towards organizing mass nonviolence? How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I'm not a moral coward. And as I said at the beginning of the book, I never take any, I've never taken foundation money, not that it was ever offered me, but I don't take the foundation money. And that's a kind of, or think tank money, or even university money. So it's a kind of a liberatory experience. If he who pays the piper calls the tune, nobody's paying this piper, so I get to call my own tune. And so I just want to look at the facts. Nobody has the right to tell Palestinians that they should practice nonviolence. I think it's a losing strategy, the strategy of armed resistance. And I've said it many times to them. Occasionally I do seminars over Skype with people in Gaza. And I'm very forthright about that. I said, it's just a mythology. There's no armed resistance. It's just something Israel exploits each time it launches one of its massacres. But there's a difference between telling them, I don't think this strategy is going to work, and telling them they don't have the right. The law is clear.
I got that. I'm not
they
saying,
have the right.
I got that.
I'm not going to tell them they have to practice nonviolence. Gandhi did not do that. During the first Arab rebellion in Palestine in 1936 to 38, he had a very heated exchange, you might say an unfriendly exchange, with Martin Buber, the so-called pacifist Zionist philosopher. And he said to Buber, well, I think it began with an interview that Gandhi gave. He said, I wish the Palestinians choose nonviolence. But then he went on to say, according to the accepted canons, C-A-N-O-N-S, according to the accepted canons of right and wrong, he didn't say Palestinians, at that point, Arabs have the right to use armed force to resist their aggressors, their occupation. So I am dealing here in the book with the law. And under the law, they have no obligation to lie down and die. They have no obligation to do that under the law. They have the right to resist, and they have the right to use force in their resistance. Now, you know, Gandhi advocated for the Jews during World War II, during the height of the Nazi Holocaust. He said they should have gone non-violently. He says that. I have mixed feelings about what he says there, but now is not the time to get into that. He's been very violently attacked for what he said about the Jews should have gone quietly to their death. The point I'm making is, but does anybody tell the people in Warsaw not to have engaged in an uprising?
Well, the difference there, though, is that it wouldn't have mattered what the Jews in World War II did anyway. They would have been forced to the ovens no matter what.
Yeah, but nobody denies them the right.
Of course not. Listen, that's not the point. That's not the point to me. The point of contention here is that the only Hamas's two choices are not lie down and die.
It's politically inexpedient what they're doing.
Yeah.
I have no doubt about that.
And they're still responsible for the consequences of,
no, they're not responsible.
Of their decisions. Yes,
right.
They are.
They are politically responsible. They're not legally responsible, and they're not morally responsible. They have the right. They have that right, and they reserve that. And not my opinion, the law is they have the right. Now, there is the question, as I said, the weapons are indiscriminate. That's technically, it's illegal under international law. In my opinion, as I said, their effectiveness is almost entirely symbolic. Number two, there's a second aspect. And here it's the only place in the book where I do disagree with international law. Well, there are, one place. There's another place where I have a partial reservation. And the problem is this, and I'm sure you'll understand it, it's perfectly obvious. What does it mean to say a weapon is indiscriminate? What does that mean? A weapon can't be objectively indiscriminate. It can only be relatively indiscriminate. As compared to another weapon, this weapon is indiscriminate. But in and of itself, a weapon can't be indiscriminate, because a weapon in 1940, which would have been described as discriminate, in 2010, it's described as indiscriminate. Okay. Why? Because technology has improved, and what seemed to be discriminate 50 years ago now seems indiscriminate, because we have what's called precision weapons.
Right.
So
and your point here is that if Hamas wasn't occupied, they would be in a position to access precision weapons. But unfortunately, because of their position,
or if they weren't poor,
right?
You know,
yeah.
it discriminates against poor. These laws discriminate against poorly endowed fighters, and richly endowed fighters get to conduct wars. So then, where does that leave us? It leaves us in a kind of ridiculous argument or a ridiculous conclusion. It really is a case of a reductio ad absurdum. So you have the human rights organizations, for example, the UN Human Rights Council. What do they say to Hamas? Well, they say, Hamas, you can't fight in densely populated areas, which is not the law, incidentally, but let's leave that aside. So you should go to non-densely populated areas, basically vacant areas of Gaza. There are a couple, a few vacant areas. Now, go to the vacant areas, but you can't use any of your weapons, because your mortars are indiscriminate and your so-called rockets are indiscriminate. So you can't use any of your weapons. Now you have a problem. As John Dugard, the leading authority in international law on the Israel-Palestine conflict,
jurist from South Africa.
Yeah, South Africa. Yeah. He's called the father of human rights in South Africa, an extremely principled, a very special human being, but that's another story. John Dugard says we have an unusual situation here. We have an occupation that's externally maintained. Mm-hmm. Israel occupies by virtue of the fact that it controls the airspace, the sea space, the borders. So, but it's all external. It's by remote control. So, you have to go to vacant spaces, says UN Human Rights Council. You can't use those rockets. You can't use the mortars because they're indiscriminate weapons, and we can only use precision weapons. And then how do you fight an external occupation? You can't do it. So in effect, you're saying Palestinians don't have any right to armed self-defense. Then just be honest about it. Just say you don't have that right because you're not rich enough to afford precision weapons. You don't have that right. The only thing that wasn't recommended to them, Palestinian, it's not just Hamas, it's the whole population. The only thing that's not recommended to them is they should line up like ducks to be shot down by Israeli planes and rockets. That to me is a reductio ad absurdum.
I get it. You're pointing to the hypocrisy and the it's totally hypocritical, and it's a flagrant double standard. Mm-hmm. There's no argument there. I guess the point of contention here is, again, even though Hamas is representing an occupied people, mm-hmm. and occupied people have every legal right to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm. Armed force to defend themselves.
To use armed force. My concern is conflating legal rights with morality, and morality includes being responsible for the consequences of your actions. So if you know, even if you have every right to launch rockets or to authorize the launching of rockets or to allow it to happen, if you know it's going to provoke a response, mm-hmm. I guess even though we're sitting here in the West, we don't live under occupation, do we have the right to say to criticize Hamas?
But Aaron, you're really mixing cause and effect. You say it's going to provoke a response. They were provoked into responding. It's Israel that breaks the ceasefires. They were provoked into responding. Right. And then what are they supposed to do?
They don't have to fire rockets. They don't.
They don't have to. And you know what? I wish they didn't. I do, because I do believe it plays into Israel's hands. However, I will never criticize them for it. And you know why?
Yes.
And I'm going to tell you why. Because the people support it. And I'm not going to tell those people, if the people were to condemn Hamas, and right now there does seem to be a strong sentiment, they want to avoid at any cost another Israeli attack. So if Hamas were to attack now, in violation of the will of the people of Gaza, I would oppose it.
You're confident
I
that
would oppose it.
a majority of
Oh, yeah,
Gazans support Hamas's and the other factions' decision?
When Israel is attacking them, yes, they do. There's no question about that. Exactly as what happened in Lebanon when Israel attacked in 2006